My name is Mark Delaney, and I've spent most of my life chasing the tangible. I was a geologist for 30 years, a career that suited my rational, grounded nature. Rocks, formations, sediment, these things made sense to me. They didn't whisper secrets or harbor grudges. They were reliable. After retiring, I took up traveling in an old RV I restored myself. It's a hobby that lets me keep exploring, documenting, and analyzing. My latest destination was Devil's Tower in Wyoming. The towering monolith was a geological marvel, columns of volcanic rock reaching skyward, mysterious and imposing. I wasn't there for folklore, but the stories intrigued me nonetheless. Some called the tower cursed. Others swore it was haunted. Tribes in the area spoke of spirits tied to the rock. They called one of them the Devil's Grin, a malevolent force that thrived on fear. I wasn't there for superstition, but part of me, a small, secret part, wanted to see if there was more to the legend than campfire tales. I arrived mid-afternoon and found a spot at a remote campsite with a clear view of the tower. It loomed over the forest, its grooves catching the sunlight in a way that made it seem alive. I stepped out of the RV and inhaled the crisp Wyoming air, already mapping out my first hike. Sheriff Louise Kane showed up not long after. I hadn't even finished unpacking when I heard the crunch of gravel under tires. She parked her patrol car nearby, stepping out with a cautious smile. "Afternoon," she said, adjusting her hat. "You camping alone?" I nodded. "Just me and the rocks." Her smile faded. "You planning to stay long?" "A few days," I said. "Why?" She hesitated, glancing at the tower. "Most folks don't camp out here alone. The locals, well, they say it's not safe." "I've heard the stories," I said with a chuckle. "Ghosts, spirits, the Devil's Grin? Sounds like a tourist pitch." She didn't laugh. "It's not a pitch. People go missing out here, Mr. Delaney. Strange things happen." "I'll be fine," I assured her, though the way she looked at me, pitying, almost resigned, left me uneasy. "Just be careful," she said before driving off. "If you hear anything, don't follow it." That first night, the forest was eerily silent. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves. Just a dense, oppressive quiet that made the air feel heavier. I told myself it was normal. Wilderness wasn't predictable after all. Around midnight, I heard whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind brushing against the RV, but the sound grew louder, words spoken just at the edge of understanding. My name was among them, soft and coaxing. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. "Mark!" It wasn't possible. I was alone. Shaking off the fear, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The forest stretched endlessly, shadows pooling between the trees. The tower loomed in the distance, its surface gleaming faintly under the moonlight. "Hello?" I called. My voice sounded too loud, too fragile against the silence. No answer. I stayed outside for a while, scanning the tree line, but nothing moved. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I found something strange. My geological tools, which I'd left neatly organized, were scattered in front of the RV. My notebook was open to a page I didn't remember writing on. Scribbled in the margins, in my own handwriting, was the word grin, repeated over and over. I stared at it, trying to recall when I'd written it. Nothing came to mind. Pushing the incident aside, I set out to hike around the base of the tower. The terrain was rugged, with patches of burnt trees and jagged rocks. As I approached, I noticed claw-like grooves etched into the sediment, a pattern that didn't fit the natural erosion I was familiar with. Then came the shadow. It passed over the rock face, huge and deliberate, as if something massive had moved in front of the sun. But when I looked up, the sky was empty. No birds, no clouds, just that strange, silent presence. I quickened my pace, unease prickling the back of my neck. The whispers returned that night, louder and more insistent. They sounded like voices I knew, my ex-wife, my son, even an old mentor. Their words twisted, mixing accusation with beckoning. "Mark, why did you leave us?" "Come closer." I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voices slipped through, clawing at my mind. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. By dawn, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. The third day brought something worse. My GPS and compass stopped working entirely, leaving me disoriented on what should have been a simple trail. No matter which direction I walked, I ended up back at the same spot, a clearing near the base of the tower. It was as if the forest had swallowed the path, folding it in on itself. I stumbled back to the RV, my pulse racing. As I approached, I saw a figure standing in the clearing. It was a man, tall and still, his face obscured by the shadows of the trees. "Hey," I called, relief flooding me. "Can you help?" The words died in my throat as the figure stepped forward. His face was wrong, elongated, his mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. His eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to drink in the light. I blinked, and he was gone. By nightfall, I was unraveling. The whispers had grown into a cacophony, overlapping voices echoing inside the RV. Shadows flickered on the walls, moving independently of the dim light I'd left on. I caught glimpses of the figure in every reflective surface. The window, the microwave, the bathroom mirror. His grin was ever present, mocking, as if daring me to look away. Desperate, I grabbed a flashlight and stormed into the forest. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Show yourself!" The whispers stopped, replaced by laughter. It was a deep, guttural sound reverberating through the trees. I followed it, my steps frantic, until I reached the base of the tower. There, etched into the rock, was the face. It was massive, its features grotesque and exaggerated. The grin stretched impossibly wide, the teeth jagged and sharp. As I stared, the rock seemed to shift, the face coming alive. Its eyes rolled toward me, and its mouth began to move. "Mark," it whispered, the sound emanating from everywhere and nowhere. "Stay!" I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering. The laughter grew louder, filling the air like a physical force. Shadows rose from the ground, taking shape, encircling me. I fell to my knees, clutching my head. "Leave me alone!" I screamed. The face loomed closer, its grin widening. "You cannot run," it said, its voice low and resonant. "You are already mine." Something snapped inside me. I forced myself to my feet, staring into the monstrous visage. "You have no power over me," I shouted, my voice trembling but defiant. "You're nothing but fear." For a moment, the laughter faltered. The shadows wavered, the face flickering like a faulty projection. Then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the clearing near the RV. The forest was still, the tower looming in the distance. I didn't wait to question what had happened. I climbed into the RV, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I reached the highway. Sheriff Kane was waiting at a checkpoint, her expression grim as I pulled up. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak. She sighed, shaking her head. Not everyone makes it out. Consider yourself lucky. Weeks later, back home, I tried to rationalize the experience. Hallucination? Sleep deprivation? Stress? I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't forget it either. One night, as I typed up my account, the computer screen flickered. For a split second, the face appeared, the grin as wide and menacing as ever. Whispers filled the room, and when I looked at my reflection in the window, my own face began to stretch, the grin spreading. The devil's grin hadn't let me go. There's a quiet unease that comes with solitude, a sensation that starts at the back of your neck and creeps downward, one you don't notice until it's too late to shake. That's what I felt the first night in Devil's Hollow, but I ignored it. I told myself it was just nerves, the thrill of being alone in the wilderness. I was here for the footage, a bold new video to resurrect my career after everything I'd lost. Red River Gorge was perfect for the kind of content I wanted. Rugged cliffs, natural arches, endless trees. It was raw, untamed beauty. People loved that. The fact that locals whispered about Devil's Hollow being cursed? Even better. A little ghost story would boost views. So when Tess Marlowe warned me to stay away from the hollow, I smiled and politely ignored her. "You don't understand," she had said, her dark eyes unwavering as she handed me a small bundle of herbs from her roadside stand. "The land remembers." "What does it remember?" I had asked, amused. "The witches," she said simply, "and the blood that stained it." I arrived at Devil's Hollow in the late afternoon, the sun throwing long shadows across the forest. The trail was overgrown but passable, leading me to a flat clearing nestled between towering cliffs. Perfect for setting up camp. I parked the RV and stepped outside, the air thick with the earthy scent of moss and decay. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint hum of the wind. It was eerie, but I brushed it off and set up my equipment. My drone would get some killer aerial shots in the morning, and my handheld camera was ready for a night of eerie B-roll. That night, as I edited some test shots in the RV, I heard whispers. Faint, like wind slipping through cracks, but too rhythmic, too deliberate. I turned off the laptop, holding my breath as I listened. The sound stopped. I checked outside. Nothing but the stillness of the trees. I laughed nervously at myself. "The wind," I muttered. "Just the wind." The next day, I ventured deeper into the hollow. The forest was denser here. The trees knotted together like a cage. Around noon, I stumbled upon something unexpected. A stone altar, half buried in the undergrowth. Its surface was etched with strange symbols, faded but still visible. I crouched, brushing the moss away to reveal more carvings. Spirals, claw-like shapes, and what looked like figures holding hands. My camera whirred to life, capturing the details. This was gold. Authentic, creepy, ancient, everything my audience would eat up. As I stood to leave, I felt it, a cold breath of air against my neck, though the day was sweltering. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but the forest was empty. My heart hammered in my chest as I packed up and headed back to camp. That night, the whispers came again, louder this time. They didn't stop when I stepped outside. If anything, they grew closer, wrapping around me like smoke. The air smelled of burning wood, though the campfire had long since died out. Then I saw them. Small piles of stones arranged in strange patterns around the RV, patterns I hadn't made. My flashlight flickered, and I caught movement at the edge of the clearing, a shadow, humanoid but impossibly tall, disappearing into the trees. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the night. I spent the rest of the night locked in the RV, every sound amplified by my fear. The next morning, I met Ethan Caldwell on the trail, a scruffy guy with a nervous energy that immediately put me on edge. "You camping out here?" he asked, his eyes darting around the trees. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "What about you?" Ethan shook his head. "Used to. Not anymore. Not since—" He trailed off, scratching at his arm. "Since what?" He hesitated, then said, "Since they came for me." I laughed nervously, waiting for the punchline, but Ethan wasn't joking. He launched into a rambling story about camping in Devil's Hollow, hearing voices, seeing figures in the dark. He lifted his sleeve to show a strange scar on his arm, a jagged, spiral-shaped mark. "They leave marks," he said, his voice a whisper. "Warnings. They don't want us here." I didn't know what to say. He must have noticed my skepticism because he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Leave while you can. They'll take you too." I shrugged him off, muttering something about being careful. Ethan shook his head, his eyes haunted. "You'll see," he said as he walked away. By the third night, the hollow didn't bother with subtlety. The whispers were relentless, no longer faint, but loud, accusatory. They spoke words I couldn't understand, their cadence rising and falling like a chant. My drone, fully charged, refused to power on, and the footage I'd shot earlier was corrupted, static, and black screens. Around midnight, the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath, and frost began forming on the inside of the RV windows. Then came the laughter. It wasn't human. High-pitched and shrill, it echoed from every direction. My flashlight flickered as I stepped outside, and there she was. The figure stood near the edge of the clearing, her outline barely visible in the mist. She wore a tattered dress that seemed to flow unnaturally, as if underwater. Her face was hidden by shadow, but I could feel her eyes on me, boring into my chest. She raised her hand, and I saw the same spiral mark from Ethan's arm, glowing faintly on her palm. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked into the forest, her movements smooth and silent. I don't know why I followed her. Curiosity? Desperation? Whatever the reason, I found myself back at the stone altar. The carvings now glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "You've trespassed," a voice whispered. It wasn't hers. It came from everywhere, a chorus of voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony. The forest came alive around me. Shadows moved in the corner of my vision, too quick to focus on. My flashlight dimmed, and I felt the cold hand of fear tighten around my throat. "Leave!" I screamed, clutching the satchel of herbs Tess had given me. "I'll leave!" But the voices only laughed. The figure appeared again, this time standing on the altar. Her face was visible now, pale, gaunt, her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too wide. "An offering," she said, her voice deep and guttural, "or you will stay." "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. Her gaze dropped to the camera hanging around my neck. It hurt more than I expected, smashing the camera against the altar. The lens shattered, the plastic casing splintering beneath my fists. I screamed as I destroyed it, the frustration and fear pouring out of me in equal measure. When it was done, the whispers stopped. The shadows retreated. The woman vanished, leaving only the stillness of the hollow. I stumbled back to the RV, battered and broken in more ways than one. When I tried the ignition, the engine roared to life without hesitation. I left Devil's Hollow that night, driving until the sun rose. Tess was waiting for me at her stand, as if she knew I'd be back. "You're alive," she said, her voice both surprised and relieved. I told her what had happened, but she didn't seem surprised. She only nodded and said, "The land remembers, but it forgives. If you listen." Back home, I tried to forget, but the mark on my forearm remained, a faint spiral etched into my skin. Every so often, I hear laughter in the quiet of the night, and I wonder if I ever really left Devil's Hollow, or if part of me is still there, bound to the witch's curse forever. I parked my RV on the edge of the Okefenokee swamp just as the sun began its slow descent behind the tree line. The stillness of the place struck me immediately, the way the air felt heavier, almost alive with the hum of unseen creatures. This was supposed to be a trip to clear my mind, a chance to reconnect with myself after the chaos of the past year. My divorce had left me drained, and the classroom where I taught seemed to shrink by the day. So here I was, on the edge of nowhere, ready to face the wildness of the swamp. The memories of camping here with my grandmother as a child had drawn me back. She had loved this place, calling it a living history book. But she also spoke of its dangers, snakes, gators, and, of course, the stories. Stories I hadn't thought about in years. I shook off the thought, stepping out into the humid air to set up my camp. The gas station clerk I'd met earlier had been chatty enough, telling me about the best trails and fishing spots, but it was the old woman at the end of the counter, the one who never stopped staring at me, who stuck in my mind. She'd waited until I was leaving before grabbing my arm with a grip much stronger than it should have been. "Don't stay in the swamp after dark," she'd warned. Her milky eyes fixed on mine, and her voice was sharp, cutting through the clerk's chatter. "It remembers." I'd laughed it off. It was probably just local superstition, something to keep tourists from wandering where they shouldn't. But now, with the shadows stretching longer over the swamp, her words returned, uninvited. I met Greg Allen that first evening. He was down by the water, tinkering with an old fishing boat. A wiry man with sun-weathered skin and a slight stoop, he looked like someone who had spent his entire life in this place. "You're new," he said by way of greeting. "Not many folks come out this way alone." I introduced myself, explaining my plan to explore the swamp and maybe relive a bit of my childhood. Greg smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Beautiful place," he said, "but it's got its stories. You know about the swamp wraith?" I shook my head, laughing nervously. I thought all the ghost stories were about the old plantations around here. "Nah," he said, turning his attention back to the boat. "There's plenty of stories, but the wraith's the one you'll want to steer clear of. Folks say she was a young woman, part of a feud back in the 1800s. She was betrayed, left to die in the swamp. Now she wanders, taking anyone who reminds her of the ones who wronged her." "Creepy," I said, trying to sound amused. "You believe in all that?" Greg looked up at me, his face suddenly serious. "Believe or don't, but don't disrespect the swamp." The first night passed uneventfully, though the swamp's quiet felt unnatural. I lay awake in my RV, listening to the occasional splash of water and the chirp of insects. Around midnight, I thought I heard laughter, light and distant, like children playing. I told myself it was just the wind. The next day, Greg offered to take me on a boat ride deeper into the swamp. "There's places you can't reach on foot," he explained. "I'll show you." We navigated the Blackwater rivers, the cypress trees looming above us like ancient sentinels. Greg pointed out wildlife, his voice calm and measured. But every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" I asked. "Nothing," he said too quickly. "Just thought I saw something." As the boat glided through the still water, I felt it too. A presence. It was the sensation of being watched, though the trees around us were empty. Then I saw it, just for a moment. A figure standing in the shallows, its outline distorted by the water's reflection. By the time I turned back to point it out, it was gone. That night, the swamp's mood shifted. The air felt heavier, and a strange mist curled around the trees. I was lying in bed when I heard the first knock on my RV door. 3 sharp raps, like knuckles on metal. "Greg," I called, pulling on a jacket and stepping outside. No one was there, just the mist and the faint rustle of the trees. But there were footprints. Small, muddy prints leading from the water's edge to my door. They stopped abruptly, as if their maker had vanished into thin air. I spent the rest of the night awake, clutching a flashlight and jumping at every sound. The third day, I went looking for Greg. His boat was still at the dock, but he was nowhere to be found. I decided to explore the trails on foot, hoping to find some sign of him. The swamp seemed different in the daylight, the shadows less menacing, but the sense of being watched never left. I found the cabin just before dusk, hidden among a cluster of ancient trees. It was small and crumbling, its roof sagging with age. Inside, the air was damp and filled with the smell of decay. On a dusty table, I found a diary, its leather cover cracked and worn. The entries were written in a spidery hand, detailing the life of a woman who had lived here during the Civil War. She wrote of betrayal, of a family feud that ended in bloodshed. The final entry was barely legible, the words smeared, "The swamp has taken me, but I will not rest." As I read, the room grew colder. The air felt wrong, heavy with something unseen. When I turned, I saw her, the same figure from the water, now standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. She raised a hand, pointing toward the swamp, and then she was gone. I ran back to the RV, but the swamp didn't let me go so easily. The mist thickened, and the laughter returned, louder this time. It came from everywhere and nowhere, mingling with whispers that spoke my name. When I reached the RV, the door was open. Inside, muddy footprints trailed across the floor, leading to the driver's seat. On the dashboard sat a single, wilting flower, a swamp lily. I started the engine, desperate to leave, but the RV wouldn't move. The tires spun uselessly in the mud, and the laughter outside grew closer. Then I saw Greg, or at least what looked like him, standing at the edge of the clearing. "Help me!" he called, his voice strained and unnatural. But it wasn't Greg. His movements were wrong, jerky, like a puppet on strings. His face twisted into a grin too wide for any human mouth, and I realized too late that I had left the RV door open. The swamp spirits didn't want me to leave. I don't know how long I stayed there, trapped in that liminal space between fear and madness. Time seemed to stretch and fold, the days blending into nights. It was the memory of my grandmother that saved me. Her voice, calm and steady, echoed in my mind. Respect the land, and it will respect you. I remembered the prayer she had taught me, a simple chant meant to honor the swamp and its spirits. I whispered the words, my voice trembling, and the air around me seemed to shift. The laughter faded, and the mist began to clear. When I opened my eyes, the swamp was silent again. I don't know how I made it out, but by dawn I was driving down the highway, the swamp receding in my rearview mirror. I never saw Greg again, and part of me wonders if he was ever real at all. But the swamp didn't let me go entirely. When I got home, I found the swamp lily on my dashboard, fresh as the day it was picked. And every now and then, in the stillness of the night, I hear it. The faint, echoing laughter of the swamp. The road to Kaibab National Forest stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by towering pines that seemed to scrape the sky. I'd always loved the untamed beauty of the wilderness, and this weekend trip was supposed to be a break from the monotony of studying geology in a cramped, noisy college town. Maya, my best friend since high school, had tagged along, eager to photograph the dramatic landscapes. Davy, a Navajo student I'd only met a few times in class, had overheard our plans and insisted on joining. He hadn't been our first choice for company. Quiet and reserved, he seemed perpetually uneasy, but his deep respect for the land intrigued me. "You guys really shouldn't be camping out here," Davy said as we pulled into the dirt trailhead. His voice was low, almost drowned out by the crunch of tires on gravel. "Why not?" Maya asked, her tone already bordering on exasperation. "It's a national forest, not a horror movie." Davy glanced at her from the back seat, his face tight with something like fear. "This place. It's sacred. My grandmother always warned me about the skinwalkers in these woods." I rolled my eyes. "Come on, Davy. Those are just old stories, right? Legends." "Legends for a reason," he muttered. Maya smirked at me and I shrugged. I didn't believe in the supernatural, but something about Davy's seriousness made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. We set up camp near a clearing surrounded by twisted junipers and ancient sandstone formations. Maya immediately started snapping photos of the golden light filtering through the trees, while Davy carefully placed a small pouch of herbs and stones near the edge of our camp. "What's that for?" I asked, more curious than mocking. "Protection," he said simply. From what, I didn't ask. The first day passed without incident. We hiked to the edge of a canyon where the land fell away into a breathtaking expanse of reds and browns. Maya found a vantage point and spent hours capturing the view while Davy and I explored the rocky terrain. By the time we returned to camp, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the air carried a chill that cut through my jacket. It was during dinner that the first strange thing happened. We were sitting around the fire, laughing at Maya's terrible attempt at cooking instant noodles, when we heard it. A high-pitched whistle. It was faint at first, rising and falling like wind through the trees. "Coyotes," I suggested, though I wasn't sure. Davy shook his head. "Coyotes don't whistle." The sound repeated, sharper this time, coming from the direction of the junipers. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the shadows. The beam caught nothing but the gnarled branches swaying in the breeze. "It's probably just the wind," Maya said, but her voice wavered. Davy didn't respond. He stared into the dark, his hands clenched into fists. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching in the dirt outside my tent. They were slow, deliberate, circling the camp. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. "Maya?" I whispered. No response. I unzipped the tent and poked my head out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak, flickering light over the clearing. I saw no one. But then my gaze dropped to the ground, and my breath caught. There were footprints in the dirt. Not human ones. They were large, clawed, and impossibly deep, as though something heavy had passed by. I shivered and crawled back into my tent, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. By morning, the tracks were gone, erased by the shifting soil, but the unease lingered. "Something was out there last night," I said as we packed up for the day's hike. Davy looked at me sharply. "You saw it?" "No, just the tracks. They were weird." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he already knew. Maya, ever the skeptic, waved it off. "Probably a bear or something. Let's not freak out over nothing." The second night was worse. We had hiked deep into the forest to find a spot Maya insisted would be perfect for night photography. The clearing was eerie, the trees bending inward like silent sentinels. As Maya set up her tripod, I noticed Davy scattering ashes from a small pouch around the perimeter of the camp. "Is that more protection stuff?" I asked. He nodded. "They don't like it. It keeps them away." I didn't ask who they were. It wasn't long before the forest came alive with sounds that made my skin crawl. Twigs snapping, distant laughter, light and childlike but wrong. "Did you hear that?" Maya whispered, lowering her camera. Before I could answer, we saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was human-shaped, but impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. "Hello?" Maya called, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a step forward, and its body moved like a puppet on strings, jerking and unnatural. Davy grabbed my arm. "We have to go. Now." "What is that?" I asked, frozen in place. "A Skinwalker," he hissed. "Don't look it in the eyes. Don't speak to it." The figure took another step, and Maya's flashlight caught its face, or what should have been a face. Its features were half-formed, shifting like molten wax, and then it spoke. "Hello?" It mimicked Maya's voice perfectly, but the tone was warped, hollow. Maya screamed and bolted for the camp, and we followed. Back at camp, we huddled by the fire, but the figures didn't stop. They circled just beyond the firelight, their movements erratic and alien. "We can't stay here," Davy said, his voice tight. He pulled out a bundle of herbs and began chanting softly in Navajo. The words were foreign to me, but the air seemed to shift around us, the temperature dropping even further. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Trying to protect us," he said. The figures grew bolder, stepping closer. One of them shifted, its form warping until it looked like Maya, her height, her shape, even her clothes. It smiled, but the expression stretched too wide, the teeth sharp and animalistic. "We have to run," Davy said. "Now!" We abandoned our gear and sprinted into the woods, the flashlight beams bouncing wildly in the dark. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches clawing at our clothes. My GPS, my one lifeline, glitched out completely, the screen flashing nonsense coordinates. "They're leading us in circles," Davy said. "How do we get out?" Maya cried, her voice cracking. Davy didn't answer. He stopped abruptly and turned to face the shadows. "Go," he said, his voice steady. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "I can hold them off. You'll be safe if you keep moving." No. Maya grabbed his arm, but he shook her off. This is my fault. I knew better than to come here. He pulled out his broken talisman and pressed it into my hand. Take this. It might help. Before I could protest, he began chanting again, louder this time. The air seemed to vibrate with his words, and the figures hesitated, their forms flickering like mirages. Go! Davy shouted. Reluctantly, I pulled Maya away, and we ran until our lungs burned. The laughter followed us, faint but persistent, like an echo we couldn't escape. When we finally stumbled out of the forest, the sky was turning pale with dawn. Our car was still there, but it had been vandalized. Long, deep scratches covered the hood, and the tires were flat. Did we really see that? Maya asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. My hand tightened around the talisman, the only thing Davy had left us. As we drove away on a spare tire, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw Davy standing at the edge of the trees, his face calm, almost smiling. But when I turned around, there was no one there. And then, faintly, from the forest behind us, came a whisper. Hello, hello. When I first heard about the ghost children of Lost Pines, I laughed it off as local folklore. I'd built my career on finding those stories, writing articles that explored the line between history and myth. That's why I drove my RV deep into the piney woods of Bastrop, Texas. I wanted to chase the legend, peel back the layers of superstition, and find the truth. The Lost Pines stretched for miles, a dense, eerie forest where the trees whispered in the wind and shadows played tricks on the eyes. The area was scarred by wildfires, with blackened stumps standing as grim reminders of the tragedies that had swept through. Somewhere in these woods, a fire in the late 1800s had killed dozens of settlers, including a group of children playing in a meadow. Locals swore their spirits still wandered the forest. I didn't believe it, but I was here to explore it. After navigating winding, desolate back roads, I parked my RV in a secluded clearing. The towering pines loomed overhead, their branches knitting together to block out the sun. It was quiet, unnaturally so. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just the sound of my own footsteps as I set up camp. That first night, I met Marcy. She wandered over from a nearby site, her dog trotting beside her. You camping alone? She asked, her voice tinged with concern. I nodded. Just here to write a story. She frowned, her eyes darting to the forest. This place has a reputation. You know about the fire? Yeah, that's why I'm here. Ghost children, right? I smirked, but Marcy didn't laugh. Listen, she said, lowering her voice. Don't go wandering off, and if you hear anything strange, don't follow it. Strange? Like what? You'll know, she said cryptically, tugging her dog's leash. The animal growled low as it glanced at my RV, its ears flat against its head. Marcy offered a strained smile. Just be careful. I chalked it up to superstition and thanked her. But as I sat by my fire that night, her words gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. The forest seemed darker than it should have, the trees leaning in as if they were eavesdropping. The first oddity happened the next morning. As I brewed coffee, I noticed something on my counter. A small wooden doll, crudely carved, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. I frowned, picking it up. It wasn't mine. I hadn't bought it, and I hadn't seen it in the RV before. Brushing it off as a souvenir left by the RV's previous owner, I tossed it into a drawer, but as I stepped outside, I saw more signs of something strange. Tiny, child-sized handprints were pressed into the ash near the edge of my campsite. I crouched to examine them, noting how perfectly formed they were. The prints led into the trees and vanished. I stared into the forest for a long moment, a chill creeping up my spine. It had to be a prank, I told myself. Maybe Marcy was messing with me. That evening, the air grew heavy with the smell of smoke. There was no fire, at least not nearby, but the acrid scent clung to everything, making my eyes water. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I set up my camera to capture the eerie silhouettes of the burnt pines against the sky. That's when I heard it. Laughter. Faint and distant, like children playing just out of sight. I froze, my heart hammering. It could have been other campers, but I hadn't seen anyone besides Marcy. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The laughter stopped. The forest fell silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. I took a shaky step back toward my RV, scanning the tree line for movement. Something darted between the trees, a shadow, low to the ground, moving too fast to be human. That night, the strangeness escalated. I locked the RV doors and drew the curtains, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I settled into bed, a soft knock echoed through the walls. I froze, holding my breath. The knock came again, deliberate and measured, followed by a faint, sing-song voice. "Let me in." I didn't move. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight on my bedside table. When I turned it on, the knocking stopped. Creeping to the window, I peeked through the curtains. At first, I saw nothing but the dark forest. Then, at the edge of the clearing, a figure emerged. A small child, her dress singed at the edges, her hair falling in limp strands over her face. "Help me," she whispered, her voice carrying unnaturally through the still night. My stomach dropped. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The girl tilted her head, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw her smile, a grotesque, too wide grin that didn't belong on a child's face. The flashlight flickered and went out. When I turned it back on, she was gone. The next morning, Marcy stopped by again. "You look like hell," she said, her tone more serious than teasing. I hesitated, then told her about the knocking, the laughter, and the child. She paled. "You saw her?" she whispered. "Who is she?" Marcy shook her head. "No one knows. Some say she was the first child to die in the fire. Others think she's something worse, something pretending to be a child." She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "You have to leave, now." I wanted to listen, but curiosity anchored me. I was too close to the story, too close to the truth. "I'll be fine," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Marcy sighed, her dog barking nervously as they walked away. "Don't say I didn't warn you." That night, I made a mistake. I heard crying, soft, pitiful sobs coming from the forest. I knew I shouldn't follow it. I knew I should stay inside. But something about the sound tugged at me, pulling me toward the trees. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped into the darkness. The crying grew louder, leading me deeper into the woods. The air grew colder, the smell of smoke stronger. I kept walking, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. Then I saw it. A building, half buried in the undergrowth, the remnants of an old schoolhouse, charred by fire but still standing. My heart pounded as I approached, my footsteps crunching on blackened debris. Inside, the air was thick and oppressive. The walls were scrawled with soot-blackened handprints, and the faint sound of children's laughter echoed through the space. I turned to leave, but the doorway was blocked. The girl was there, her head tilted, her empty eyes fixed on mine. The walls seemed to come alive, flickering with ghostly flames. Shadows of children appeared, their faces burned and hollow, their laughter turning into shrieks. "Stay," the girl whispered, her voice layered with something deeper, something ancient and malevolent. I screamed, shoving past her and running into the woods. The laughter followed me, the sound distorting into something inhuman. Trees blurred past as I sprinted, my lungs burning, until finally the RV came into view. I didn't stop. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. As I reached the main highway, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror, a group of shadowy figures standing at the edge of the forest, their hollow eyes watching me go. Back home, I tried to move on, but the experience clung to me. When I reviewed my photos from the trip, I found something chilling. In nearly every shot of the forest, faint figures lingered in the background, children with hollow eyes and burned faces. The wooden doll I'd thrown in the drawer was waiting for me on my desk, its head tilted just like the girl's. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard faint laughter outside my window. They had followed me. My name's Rebecca Wallace, but everyone calls me Becca. I'm a photographer, traveling solo most of the time, chasing light and landscapes that can't be found in guidebooks. That's how I ended up in Monument Valley, on the border of Arizona and Utah. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip, just me, my camera, and the breathtaking sandstone buttes. Instead, it became a nightmare I can't wake up from. I wasn't entirely alone this time. Melissa Parker, a social media influencer I'd met during a workshop, had tagged along at the last minute. She thought it would be fun content for her followers. I wasn't thrilled about it, but Melissa's relentless energy was hard to say no to. We hired 2 guides for the trip. Graham Keller, a no-nonsense local who'd been living in the area for decades, and Sam Yazzie, a young Navajo park ranger. Graham was gruff and practical, with a perpetual frown that deepened whenever Melissa pointed her phone at him. Sam, on the other hand, was friendly and eager, though his smile faltered whenever Graham mentioned our route. Our plan was to explore some of the lesser-known areas of the park, places off the tourist trail. I wanted unique shots for an upcoming gallery exhibit, and Melissa wanted footage that no one else had. It seemed perfect at the time. The first day was uneventful, mostly. We parked the Jeep near a rock formation Graham called the Whisperin' Mesa. I asked why it was called that, but he just shook his head. "You don't want to know," he muttered. Melissa laughed, dismissing his cryptic tone. "Let me guess, ghost stories?" Sam shot her a sharp look. "It's not a joke, this place. It has rules. Stay together, and whatever you do, don't wander off, especially after dark." I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. It was just a story, right? As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air turned cold. I set up my camera to capture the last rays of light over the valley, but something felt off. The silence was unnerving, the kind of quiet that presses into your ears until it hurts. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Melissa frowned. "Hear what?" I couldn't explain it. It wasn't a sound exactly, but a presence, a weight hanging in the air. I forced a laugh. Never mind, probably just the wind. But there was no wind. That night, as we sat around the fire, the noises started. Faint whispers carried on the still air, just beyond the circle of light. Graham and Sam exchanged a glance, their faces grim. "It's just the wind," Melissa said, rolling her eyes. "It's not," Sam whispered. "We should leave." "Leave? We just got here." Melissa laughed, holding up her phone. "And besides, I haven't even gotten the perfect shot yet." Graham sighed. "It's your call, Becca, but don't say I didn't warn you." I hesitated. I didn't want to seem paranoid, especially in front of Melissa. "We'll be fine," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The first real sign that something was wrong came the next morning. My camera, fully charged the night before, was dead. Melissa's phone wouldn't turn on either. We chalked it up to the cold, but Sam looked worried. "This isn't normal," he muttered, checking the Jeep's GPS. "It's not working either." Melissa groaned. "Great. How am I supposed to post anything?" "We'll use the map," Graham said, "but we need to move." We packed up quickly, but the Jeep didn't get far. It hit a patch of soft sand and sank, the tires spinning uselessly. Graham cursed under his breath as we unloaded supplies. "We'll hike back to the main road," he said. "Shouldn't take more than a few hours." The hike was harder than I expected. The sun was relentless, and the sand seemed to pull at my boots with every step. Melissa lagged behind, complaining about the heat. Graham and Sam were quiet, their eyes scanning the horizon as if they were expecting something. It was late afternoon when Melissa stopped. "Did you see that?" she asked, pointing to a ridge in the distance. I squinted. At first, I saw nothing, just the jagged outline of the rocks. Then it moved, a shadowy figure, low to the ground, crawling unnaturally fast before disappearing behind a boulder. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. "Keep moving," Graham said, his voice tight. As night fell, the whispers returned. They seemed closer now, circling us like predators. Sam lit a small fire, but the light only seemed to deepen the shadows. I thought I saw movement at the edge of the camp, a flash of pale skin, a glint of eyes. But when I looked again, it was gone. Melissa wandered off with her phone, muttering something about getting signal. I called after her, but she didn't respond. Graham and Sam exchanged a worried look. "We need to find her," Sam said, grabbing a flashlight. We searched for hours, calling her name, but the only response was the wind. Finally, just before dawn, Melissa stumbled back into camp, her clothes torn and her face pale. "Where the hell have you been?" I demanded. She didn't answer. Her eyes were unfocused and her movements were jerky, almost inhuman. Sam tried to talk to her, but she just smiled, a strange, too wide grin that made my skin crawl. The next day, things got worse. Melissa's behavior grew more erratic. She muttered to herself, her voice low and guttural, like someone speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Her pupils were wrong, elongated like a cat's. "I don't think that's Melissa anymore," Sam whispered to me when she wasn't looking. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "She's been taken." That night, the thing stalking us made its move. It started with the whispers, growing louder and more frantic. Then came the scratching, a slow, deliberate scrape of claws against the Jeep's metal frame. Graham grabbed his rifle, but when he stepped outside, it was waiting for him. The creature was a nightmare come to life, tall and emaciated, with limbs that bent the wrong way. Its skin was pale and mottled, and its eyes glowed like hot coals. It smiled, showing too many teeth, and let out a low, guttural growl. "Stay back!" Graham shouted, firing a shot. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it lunged at him with impossible speed. Chaos erupted. Sam grabbed me, pulling me toward the ridge. "We need to get to the sacred site," he shouted. "It won't follow us there." "What about Graham?" I screamed. "He's buying us time. Move!" We ran, the whispers turning into deafening screams. Melissa, or whatever she had become, appeared in front of us, her body contorting as she crawled on all fours, blocking our path. Sam shoved me behind him, chanting in Navajo as he threw a pouch of herbs at her. She shrieked, her skin sizzling where the herbs touched it, and vanished into the darkness. We reached the sacred site just as dawn broke, collapsing onto the rocky ground. The creature didn't follow. Sam said a prayer, his voice trembling, and I watched the horizon waiting for the next attack. It never came. We made it out alive, but Graham didn't. His sacrifice haunts me, as do the memories of Melissa's twisted smile and the creature's glowing eyes. I still hear the whispers in my dreams, and sometimes when I'm alone, I catch a glimpse of something at the edge of my vision. They say Monument Valley is beautiful, and it is. But it's also something else, something ancient and hungry. I'll never go back. And if you're smart, you won't either. There's a certain freedom in being alone. Out here in the Monongahela National Forest, surrounded by nothing but towering pines and the whisper of wind, the world feels distant, small, manageable. That's why I come to places like this, to breathe, to let the weight of my past settle for a while. Devil's Creek wasn't on the official map, and that was part of the appeal. The name was what drew me in, though. Something dark and wild about it. A challenge. I'd parked my RV on the edge of the forest that afternoon and planned to spend the next week fishing, hiking, and photographing the rugged beauty of West Virginia. The first day went as planned. Quiet, uneventful, but as the sun began to set, painting the trees in bloody hues, a couple of hunters wandered into my camp. A man and a woman, grizzled and sunburned, with the kind of wary eyes that suggested they weren't here for sightseeing. "You staying out here by yourself?" the man asked, his voice gruff. "Yeah," I said, pausing to toss another log on the fire. "Something wrong?" He glanced at the woman. Maria, she said her name was. Her fingers fidgeted with a silver cross hanging around her neck. "You should be careful," she said softly. "Devil's Creek's got a way of getting into your head." I raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man, Jim, spit into the dirt and muttered, "Old stories. They say there's something out there, something that don't belong." I chuckled, but it sounded hollow even to my ears. "Ghost stories, huh? I've heard worse." "It's not a joke," Maria insisted. "We've heard screams out there, seen things." "Things?" I repeated, but Jim cut her off. "Just don't wander too close to the creek at night," he said, tipping his hat before they left. "You hear something calling, you keep walking." I sat by the fire long after they were gone, staring into the flames. The forest around me was silent, unnaturally so, as if holding its breath. I shrugged off their warnings. I'd heard my share of ghost stories in the woods, and they all ended the same way, with someone spooking themselves into a frenzy over nothing. Still, I made sure my RV door was locked before I went to bed. The first night passed without incident. The next morning, I grabbed my fishing gear and set off toward the creek, following an overgrown trail that wound through the pines. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of moss and damp earth. This was why I loved being out here. Just me and the wilderness, no one to answer to. When I reached the water, it was almost disappointingly serene. Devil's Creek wasn't much to look at, just a narrow stream winding through the trees, its surface shimmering like glass. I spent the better part of the morning fishing, catching a few small trout and letting my mind wander. It wasn't until I packed up to head back that I noticed the figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a tall man standing on the opposite bank, dressed in what looked like red flannel. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. "You lost?" No response. I took a step closer, but when I blinked, he was gone. I told myself it was nothing, a shadow, a reflection. But as I hiked back to camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. By the time I returned, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That's when the real trouble started. I was setting up my stove to cook dinner when my flashlight flickered and died. I'd checked the batteries before I left, but I swapped them out anyway. Still nothing. My GPS wouldn't turn on either, even though it had worked fine earlier. Great, I thought, just what I need, half my gear crapping out on me. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, low and mournful, weaving through the trees. But then it grew louder, closer. Voices, faint and guttural, like someone muttering just outside my window. I froze, holding my breath. The RV was locked, but the thin walls offered little comfort. "Hello?" I called out, hoping it was a camper or hiker who'd gotten lost. The voices stopped. Then came a knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. Every instinct told me not to open it, but curiosity won out. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding, and cracked the door open. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no rustling in the bushes. Just darkness. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands trembling. That's when I saw it. A shadow moving just beyond the tree line, tall and impossibly thin. It wasn't a man, I realized. It wasn't anything I could explain. The next morning, I decided to leave. Whatever was happening out here, I wanted no part of it. But as I packed up, a sheriff's truck pulled into the campground. A woman stepped out, her uniform crisp and her expression unreadable. "You Logan?" she asked, nodding toward my RV. "Yeah, what's this about?" "I'm Deputy Kate," she said. "You're camped awful close to Devil's Creek." I gave her a tight smile. "I figured that out." She leaned against the truck, crossing her arms. "We've had reports of people going missing in this area. Strange sightings. I'm here to make sure you're not planning to stay much longer." "I'm leaving," I said quickly. "You won't have to worry about me." She hesitated, studying me. "Good. Just, if you hear anything, see anything, don't investigate. Keep your head down and get out." As much as I wanted to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creek wasn't finished with me. That night, I woke to find myself sitting upright in bed, my heart racing. I had no memory of falling asleep or getting into that position. Outside, the voices had returned, louder this time. One of them sounded like a child crying softly. "Help me," it whimpered, the sound floating just beyond my window. My stomach turned. I knew better than to go outside, but the guilt was overwhelming. What if it really was a child? What if someone needed me? I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold. The crying led me toward the creek, where the figure in red waited, standing perfectly still. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaken. It didn't answer. Instead, it took a step toward me, its limbs jerking unnaturally like a marionette. Its face was wrong, blurred, featureless, as if my eyes couldn't quite focus on it. The thing spoke then, its voice deep and mocking. "Logan!" I turned and ran, crashing through the forest until I reached my RV. I locked the door behind me, but the knocking started almost immediately, followed by laughter, low and guttural, echoing through the night. By dawn, I was ready to abandon everything and walk out if I had to. But as I opened the door, Deputy Kate was waiting, her face pale. "I saw lights," she said. "Figured you'd need help." "You don't understand," I said, my voice cracking. "There's something out here. It's not human." She didn't argue. Instead, she pulled a shotgun from her truck. "Let's go." We made our way back to the creek, Kate leading the way. The forest seemed darker now, the trees pressing in from all sides. When we reached the water, the figure was waiting, its red clothes standing out like blood against the gray morning light. Kate raised her gun. "Stay back!" The thing laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "You think that'll stop me?" It hissed, its voice overlapping with others, a cacophony of whispers and screams. It lunged, faster than anything I'd ever seen. Kate fired, the blast echoing through the forest, but the creature didn't stop. It slammed into her, knocking the gun from her hands. I grabbed a burning log from the remains of a nearby fire pit, swinging it wildly. The flames licked at the creature's flesh, and it shrieked, stumbling back into the shadows. "Move!" Kate shouted, grabbing my arm. We ran without looking back, the thing's laughter chasing us all the way to the road. When we finally reached her truck, she turned to me, her face grim. "That wasn't a man," she said, "and it's not gone." I nodded, too shaken to speak. We didn't say another word as she drove me to the nearest town. I haven't been back to Devil's Creek since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the laughter again, faint and distant, and I know it's still out there, waiting. Elkmont Ghost Town wasn't on any tourist map, and that was exactly why I went there. I'd read about it in an old book about the Great Smoky Mountains, a place abandoned in the 1940s after the national park took over. Once a thriving logging community, and later a vacation retreat for the wealthy, the cabins were now left to rot in the forest. I could almost hear their stories whispering through the empty windows. I was alone, as I preferred to be, rolling into the park in my beat-up RV late one afternoon. The campground near Elkmont was nearly empty, and the cool November air carried a stillness that I mistook for peace. I parked on the edge of the lot, my RV snug against a thicket of trees. This was my element, solitude and history. My plan was to explore the cabins, photograph their decaying beauty, and uncover a few stories for my blog. It was a quiet life, but it was mine. Since the divorce, I'd grown comfortable being alone. Sometimes I even welcomed it. The first sign that something was wrong came that evening. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, turning the sky a soft lavender, I heard a knock on my RV door. I wasn't expecting company, and when I opened it, I was surprised to find a young park ranger standing there. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat. His name tag read Paul. "You planning to stay here overnight?" I nodded. "Yeah, is that a problem?" He hesitated, glancing toward the shadowed woods. "Not exactly. Just be careful. Elkmont's got a reputation." "For what?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. He shifted his weight, clearly debating how much to say. "Strange stuff. Campers hearing voices, seeing things that shouldn't be there. You'd be better off leaving before dark." I almost laughed. It sounded like the kind of thing rangers told campers to keep them from wandering off trail. "I think I'll be fine. Thanks for the warning, though." Paul didn't press, but as he turned to leave, he added, "If you hear anything tonight, stay inside. Don't go looking." The first few hours passed uneventfully. I cooked dinner over my small camp stove, then settled in with my laptop to jot down notes about the area's history. I didn't hear anything unusual until well after dark. At first, it was faint, a high, lilting sound that could have been the wind, but it grew louder, rising and falling in rhythmic bursts. Laughter. Children's laughter. My stomach twisted. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here, let alone kids. I peeked out the window. The forest beyond my RV was pitch black, except for a faint, flickering light moving between the trees. A lantern, but it swayed too smoothly, too deliberately, as if carried by invisible hands. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, maybe another camper. But I locked the door anyway. I wasn't about to let my imagination get the better of me. Not yet. The next morning, I packed my camera and set off to explore Elkmont. The trail was overgrown, the forest reclaiming what humans had abandoned decades ago. The first cabin I came across was crumbling, its roof caved in and its windows shattered. But inside, the air felt heavy, as if the walls were still holding secrets. I took a few photos, documenting the warped floorboards and peeling wallpaper. Near the fireplace, I found a child's toy, a small wooden horse, its paint faded but intact. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It didn't belong here. Not after all this time. "Hey, didn't think anyone else was out here." I jumped, nearly dropping the toy. A woman stood in the doorway, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder. She was in her late 20s, with short brown hair and a confident smile. "Sorry," she said, laughing. "Didn't mean to scare you. I'm Lisa." "Claire," I said, slipping the toy into my pocket. I wasn't sure why I kept it. She glanced around the cabin, her brow furrowing. "Creepy, isn't it? I heard about this place and thought I'd check it out. Mind if I tag along?" I hesitated. I liked being alone, but something about her boldness was reassuring. "Sure," I said. "Just don't wander off." As we explored, Lisa's chatter filled the silence, a welcome distraction from the unease creeping into my chest. But the deeper we went, the stranger things became. At one cabin, we found symbols carved into the walls, circles and spirals that reminded me of protective wards. "Probably just kids messing around," Lisa said, but I wasn't so sure. Then there were the footprints. Small, barefoot prints in the dirt leading from one cabin to the next. They were too fresh to be decades old, but there was no sign of anyone else nearby. By the time we returned to the RV, the sun was sinking low. Lisa asked to camp with me, and I agreed. Safety in numbers, I told myself. But the truth was, I didn't want to be alone. That night, the forest came alive. We were sitting by the fire when we heard it. The laughter again, closer this time. Lisa froze, her eyes darting to the trees. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, gripping my flashlight. The laughter was joined by voices, faint and distorted, calling out in the darkness. "Claire! Lisa!" "Who's there?" Lisa shouted, standing. "Don't!" I grabbed her arm, my mind flashing back to Paul's warning. "Stay by the fire." But Lisa pulled away. "What if someone's hurt? We can't just ignore it." Before I could stop her, she disappeared into the woods, her flashlight bobbing in the distance. I cursed under my breath and followed, my heart pounding. I found her standing at the edge of a clearing, staring at something I couldn't see. "Lisa?" I whispered, stepping closer. She didn't respond. Her flashlight lay on the ground, its beam cutting through the mist. Then I saw them. Children, pale and ghostly, their eyes like hollow voids. They stood in a half circle, watching us silently. One of them held a doll, its head lolling to the side. "Lisa, we need to go," I said, my voice shaken. "They're just kids," she murmured, taking a step forward. "They're lost." "No, they're not." I grabbed her arm, pulling her back, but it was too late. The children began to change, their faces twisted, mouths stretching impossibly wide. Their eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light as they advanced, their movements jerky and inhuman. Lisa screamed as one of them lunged, its clawed hands reaching for her. I dragged her away, stumbling through the trees until we burst onto the trail. Behind us, the children's laughter echoed, mingled with a guttural growl that didn't belong to anything human. When we reached the RV, Ranger Paul was waiting, his face pale. "I saw the lights," he said, his voice grim. "You need to leave, now." "What are they?" I demanded, my breath ragged. "What do they want?" He hesitated. "They're the children who died here a long time ago, a fire at a camp. They don't know they're dead. They try to bring others into their world." Lisa was trembling, her face streaked with tears. "I saw them. They almost—" Paul cut her off. "Get in the RV. Don't stop driving until you're out of the park." We didn't argue. As I sped down the winding roads, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them one last time. The children stood at the edge of the trees, their hollow eyes watching us leave. One of them raised a hand, as if in farewell. We didn't stop until we reached the next town. Lisa left the next morning, refusing to talk about what had happened. I didn't blame her. I couldn't bring myself to speak about it either. Weeks later, I received an email with no subject line. Attached was a single photo. Lisa standing in the clearing, surrounded by the ghostly children. Her face was blurred, unrecognizable. I deleted the email and haven't been back to Elkmont since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear laughter outside my RV, faint and distant, and I wonder if they've followed me. The woods had always been my refuge, a place where the chaos of the world seemed distant, muffled by the trees. When I rolled into Devil's Den State Park, the last traces of autumn clinging to the Arkansas hills, I felt that familiar pull of solitude. My plan was simple. Camp, hike, and lose myself in the kind of peace only the forest could provide. But peace wasn't what I found. The campground was quieter than I expected for a crisp November weekend, and I was glad to have my pick of sights. I parked my small RV at the edge of the lot near a winding trailhead. By the time I set up, the sun had dipped low, staining the trees a rusty orange. It was then I met them. Jason and Rachel and a man named Tom. Jason was the first to approach. "Hey, you mind if we join you?" he asked, grinning as he gestured to the fire I'd just started. Behind him, Rachel waved, her arms full of firewood. I hesitated. I didn't usually share my space, but something about their friendliness was hard to refuse. I shrugged. "Sure, plenty of room." Tom showed up later, a quiet figure who seemed to drift towards the warmth like a moth. He kept to himself, but when Jason tried to lighten the mood with a joke about ghost stories around the fire, Tom's expression turned grim. "Ghost stories aren't funny around here," he muttered, staring into the flames. "Why's that?" Jason pressed, always curious. "This place has a reputation," Tom said, his voice low. "Disappearances, people hearing voices, things that don't make sense." Jason laughed it off, but Rachel and I exchanged uneasy glances. I didn't know it then, but Tom's words were more than campfire talk. The next morning, Jason suggested a hike to Whispering Hollow, a place he'd heard about online. "There's supposed to be a cave with old carvings," he said, pulling up a blurry photo on his phone. "Think of the photos we could get." Rachel groaned. "Jason, it's probably just graffiti." But I was intrigued. I hadn't heard of Whispering Hollow, and I'd done my research before coming here. It wasn't on the park's map, which made it all the more enticing. Tom, surprisingly, agreed to join us. "Better to stick together," he said, his tone unreadable. The trail started easy enough, a well-worn path winding through the pines. But as we ventured further, the forest thickened, and the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded. It was Jason who first noticed something odd. "Hey, look at this," he said, holding up a small, pristine child's shoe. It was spotless, like it had just been placed there. "That's weird," I muttered, my stomach twisting. No one else seemed concerned, though Rachel frowned and kicked it aside. As we pressed on, the trail disappeared entirely, washed out by rain. "Great," Rachel muttered. "Now what?" "We go this way," Jason said confidently, pointing to an overgrown path. "Why do I feel like this is a terrible idea?" I said, half joking. Tom didn't laugh. He just stared at the trees, his face pale. By the time we reached the hollow, the air felt different, heavy and still. The cave Jason had been so eager to find loomed ahead, its entrance shadowed and ringed with carvings. They weren't graffiti. These were intricate, ancient symbols etched deep into the stone, spirals and figures that seemed to writhe when I looked too long. Jason was already snapping pictures. "This is so cool." Rachel shook her head. "It's creepy." I ran my fingers over one of the carvings, tracing its sharp edges. The stone felt cold, almost wet, and a shiver ran down my spine. "We shouldn't be here," I said softly. Jason, of course, ignored me. "I'm going in," he announced, heading for the cave. "Jason, don't," Rachel started, but he was already inside. We waited in tense silence, the shadows lengthening as the day began to fade. "Jason?" Rachel called, her voice tight. He stumbled out moments later, his face ashen. "There's something in there," he whispered. "What did you see?" Tom asked sharply. Jason shook his head, his eyes darting to the trees. Eyes. They were glowing, watching me. I wanted to leave, but the walk back felt impossibly long. We decided to set up camp nearby, agreeing to leave at first light. That night, the real terror began. It started with whispers. Faint at first, just murmurs carried by the wind. But they grew louder, distinct. Jason. Emma. It was our names, spoken in voices that sounded almost familiar but slightly wrong. Who's out there? Rachel shouted, grabbing her flashlight. Tom pulled her back. Don't. It's not someone. It's something. What does that mean? I demanded, my chest tightening. Skinwalker, Tom said, his voice steady but grim. They mimic voices to lure you away. Stay near the fire. None of us slept. The whispers circled the camp, taunting us. Then came the laughter, high-pitched and hollow like a child's but warped and wrong. Jason was the first to crack. I can't just sit here, he shouted, bolting into the woods. Jason, no, Rachel screamed, chasing after him. Tom cursed and grabbed his knife, motioning for me to stay close as we followed. We found Rachel quickly, standing frozen in the trees. He's gone, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I saw him run, but it wasn't him. It turned into something else. A guttural growl rumbled from the darkness. Then we saw it. A figure standing just beyond the firelight, its shape shifting unnaturally. At first, it looked like Jason, but its eyes glowed and its mouth twisted into an inhuman grin. Tom stepped forward, holding his knife. Get back, he shouted, brandishing the blade. The creature didn't move, but its grin widened. It attacked suddenly, lunging at Tom with claws that glinted in the firelight. He slashed at it, the blade grazing its arm. It shrieked, a sound that rattled my bones, and stumbled back. Fire! Tom yelled. It's afraid of fire. I grabbed a burning log from the fire pit and swung it wildly, forcing the creature to retreat. It melted into the shadows, but I knew it wasn't gone. Tom was bleeding, deep gashes across his chest. Get Rachel out of here, he gasped, shoving me toward her. I'll hold it off. I didn't argue. I grabbed Rachel and ran, dragging her through the forest as the whispers and laughter followed us. Every time I glanced back, I expected to see the creature closing in, but the trees were mercifully empty. When we reached the main trail, the sun was beginning to rise. The whispers stopped, replaced by the familiar sounds of birds and wind. Rachel and I collapsed at the campground, exhausted and shaking. Tom never came back. Later, I saw his name in the news. His body was found near Whispering Hollow, mangled and unrecognizable. They called it an animal attack. I know better. Whatever was in that hollow, it wasn't human. It wasn't natural. And it's still out there waiting for the next curious soul to wander too far. The forest was supposed to be my refuge. After 20 years as a firefighter, I was looking for something quieter, somewhere I could be alone. My RV had become my home these past few months, rolling from one wilderness to the next. Shoshone National Forest, Wyoming, was my latest stop, sprawling, rugged, and remote. It promised the kind of solitude I needed. The ranger at the entrance had handed me a map and wished me a good stay. He hadn't mentioned Dead Man's Trail. I found it on my second day, an unmarked path branching off the main hiking loop. The sign, faded and half-rotted, bore only the faintest letters, Dead Man's Trail. I laughed bitterly at the name. A bit on the nose, I muttered, stepping off the main path. The forest around me grew denser. Pines towered overhead, blocking out the midday sun, and the air felt heavier, cooler. I wasn't sure what drew me down that path. Maybe curiosity, maybe something darker. The trail twisted through the woods, narrowing with each step. My GPS, which I'd clipped to my belt, began to glitch, its screen flickering. I tapped it in frustration, but the map refused to load. With a sigh, I shoved it into my pocket and decided to trust my instincts. The first strange sound came about a mile in, a rhythmic clink, like metal on rock. At first, I thought it was a bird or an animal, but as I listened, the sound grew clearer. It was unmistakable, the steady, deliberate strike of a pickaxe. I stopped, scanning the woods. "Hello?" I called out. The clinking stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I shook my head and pressed on, convincing myself it was just a coincidence. About 20 minutes later, I found the first artifact, a rusted pickaxe lying half buried in the dirt. The handle was splintered, the head covered in moss, but it looked eerily out of place. I picked it up, brushing off the grime, and noticed initials carved into the wood. J.W. A chill ran through me, but I pushed the feeling aside. I didn't believe in ghost stories. I ran into the ranger on my way back to the RV. He was standing near the main trail, his green uniform blending into the pines. Tall and lean, with a weathered face and piercing eyes, he looked like he belonged to the forest. "Enjoying your hike?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Yeah," I replied, hesitating. "Found a trail back there. Dead Man's Trail." The ranger's expression darkened. "That's not on the map for a reason. Best leave it alone." "Why?" I asked, forcing a chuckle. "Is it haunted?" "Something like that." He stepped closer, his gaze unflinching. "People go missing back there. You seem like a smart guy. Don't push your luck." His words hung heavy in the air, but I wasn't ready to let go of the mystery. Something about the trail had hooked me. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, brushing past him. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the pickaxe. I'd left it on the picnic table outside my RV, intending to leave it there in the morning. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I started hearing noises again. Faint, rhythmic clinking echoing through the woods. I stepped outside with my flashlight, scanning the clearing. The pickaxe was still there, but the sound was growing louder, more deliberate. My pulse quickened as I shone the light toward the trees. Lanterns. At least a dozen flickering lights bobbed between the pines, too steady to be fireflies. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The light of my flashlight didn't seem to reach them, and as I stood there, the pickaxe fell off the table with a heavy thud. "Who's out there?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. The lantern stopped moving. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, one by one, they winked out, plunging the forest into darkness. I backed into the RV and locked the door. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I returned to Dead Man's Trail, determined to put my unease to rest. The pickaxe was strapped to my backpack, a strange comfort despite its weight. The forest felt different this time, quieter, heavier. The trail wound deeper into the woods, leading me to a clearing surrounded by jagged cliffs. In the center was a gaping hole, a collapsed mine shaft, its edges ringed with rotting timber. Scattered around it were more tools, helmets, shovels, lanterns, all rusted and abandoned. As I approached the shaft, the air grew colder. I leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness. The smell of damp earth and decay wafted up, and for a moment, I thought I heard whispers, soft, indistinct, and layered, like a dozen voices speaking at once. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The ground felt unsteady beneath my feet, and I noticed footprints in the dirt, fresh, circling mine. The first shadow appeared as I turned back toward the trail. It was tall and thin, with a wide-brimmed hat and glowing eyes that pierced the gloom. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. I froze, my throat tightening. "Who are you?" I called out. The figure didn't answer. Instead, more shadows began to emerge, their forms flickering like dying flames. They held lanterns that cast no light and pickaxes that gleamed despite their age. Panic surged through me as they began to move, their steps slow and deliberate. I stumbled back toward the shaft, clutching the pickaxe like a lifeline. The whispers grew louder, forming words. "You didn't save them." I shook my head, my grip tightening. "No, this isn't real." But the shadows didn't stop. They were close now, close enough for me to see their faces. Hollow, skeletal, with blackened teeth and burned skin. Their lanterns swung in unison, casting strange, shifting shadows across the clearing. I backed up to the edge of the mine shaft, my mind racing. The shadows surrounded me, their voices overlapping in a relentless cacophony. "Your fault. You let them die. You belong with us." Images of the fire flashed through my mind, the flames licking at the walls, the screams of the family I couldn't save. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, gasping for air. Then I saw it. A pile of gold nuggets near the edge of the shaft, glinting in the dim light. It was out of place, pristine, as though someone had left it there as an offering. I didn't think. I grabbed the pickaxe and swung it with all my strength, smashing the gold into fragments. The sound echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. The shadows let out an unearthly wail, their forms flickering and distorting. One by one, they dissolved into black mist, their voices fading into silence. I don't remember leaving the trail. Somehow I found my way back to the RV, my legs trembling with every step. The forest seemed brighter now, less oppressive, but the weight in my chest remained. As I packed up to leave, the ranger appeared again, standing at the edge of the clearing. He didn't say anything, just nodded as though he already knew what had happened. I drove away without looking back, but even now, I can't forget the shadows or the whispers. They forced me to confront my guilt, to face the ghosts I'd been running from. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of pickaxes in the distance. The forest was supposed to heal me. That's what the therapist said. Get out into nature. Reconnect with yourself. So I packed my RV and drove to Ocala National Forest, determined to leave my ghosts behind. But even as I pulled into the secluded campsite near Juniper Springs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was peaceful at first, the kind of silence I'd been craving for months. Towering oaks and pines swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows stretching long across the dirt road. I parked the RV, stepped outside, and inhaled deeply, hoping the crisp air would fill the hollow ache in my chest. The site was perfect, isolated but not too far from the main road. A fire pit stood waiting, ringed by smooth stones, and a picnic table sat under the shade of an ancient oak. It was idyllic, but as I unpacked, an unease settled over me like a cold fog. I told myself it was just nerves. After all, this was my first solo trip since James died. I shook my head, pushing the thought away, and focused on setting up camp. By the time I got the firewood stacked and the RV leveled, the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in the hues of gold and crimson. A normal person might have felt accomplished. I just felt tired. It wasn't long after sunset when things started to go wrong. I'd been writing in my journal by the light of the lantern, trying to put my feelings into words when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched laugh, like a child playing somewhere in the dark. I froze, my pen hovering above the page. The sound came again, drifting through the trees. "Mama," a voice called, soft and distant. There weren't supposed to be other campers nearby. I'd checked the registry at the ranger station. My stomach tightened as I stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense underbrush and skeletal branches. "Hello?" I called, my voice unsteady. "Is someone out there?" Silence. Just the rustling of leaves and the faint chirp of crickets. I scanned the campsite, but nothing seemed out of place. With a nervous laugh, I told myself it was just the wind and went back inside. But the unease lingered. That night, I barely slept, my mind replaying the strange laughter over and over. The next morning, I found it. A small, red toy car sitting on the picnic table. It was old, its paint chipped, the kind of thing you'd find in a thrift store, but I hadn't brought it, and there was no one else around. A chill ran through me as I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. James used to collect toy cars like this, his desk at home covered in rows of them. My throat tightened as I set it down, trying to shake the memory. By midday, the clouds had rolled in, dark and heavy. I decided to hike a nearby trail to clear my head, but even the beauty of the forest couldn't calm my nerves. The air felt thicker somehow, the trees pressing closer. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. It wasn't until I returned to the RV that I saw him. A boy, no older than 10, standing at the edge of the clearing. His clothes were dirty, his hair matted, and his wide eyes glinted in the dim light. "Are you lost?" I asked, stepping cautiously toward him. He nodded. "I can't find my mom." My heart ached at the fear in his voice. "Come inside. We'll figure this out." The boy introduced himself as Tommy, but something about him felt off. His answers were vague, his gaze distant, as though he wasn't fully present. When I asked how he'd gotten lost, he shrugged. "I don't remember." His hands were clean despite the dirt on his clothes, and his bare feet didn't seem scratched or bruised. I tried not to overthink it, convincing myself he was just traumatized. I gave him a sandwich and water, watching as he ate in silence. But every so often, he'd glance toward the RV window, his eyes narrowing. "What are you looking at?" I asked. "They're here," he whispered. "Who's here?" "The shadows." That night, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, blending with the rustling leaves, but as the hours passed, they grew louder, distinct voices murmuring just outside the RV. I couldn't make out the words, but they sent shivers down my spine. Tommy sat on the couch, staring blankly at the door. "They don't like the light," he said. "Who doesn't?" I demanded, but he didn't answer. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I peered out the window. My breath caught. Shadows moved between the trees, Humanoid figures, their forms fluid and unnatural. They lingered at the edge of the clearing, never stepping into the lantern's glow. My mind raced. This had to be a trick of the light, a mix of exhaustion and imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I found a note tucked into my journal, written in my own handwriting. The boy is not real. Leave now. My hands trembled as I read it over and over. I hadn't written it, at least not that I could remember. Tommy watched me from across the RV, his face unreadable. "I think it's time we find help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "No," he said sharply, "you can't leave." The look in his eyes made my blood run cold. It wasn't the look of a scared child. It was something older, darker, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. That night, the shadows came closer. They pressed against the RV, their forms twisting and writhing. The whispers turned into guttural growls, voices overlapping in a cacophony of accusations. "It's your fault," they hissed. "You killed him." I clutched my ears, but the voices only grew louder. Memories of James flooded my mind. Our last argument, the crash, his lifeless body in the driver's seat. I fell to my knees, sobbing as the shadows pounded on the windows. Tommy stood in the middle of the RV, his expression calm. "You have to face it," he said. "They won't leave until you do." The shadows surged, their forms melting into the walls. I screamed, feeling their cold fingers on my skin, pulling at my soul. But somewhere in the chaos, Tommy's words echoed, "Face it." "I didn't kill him," I shouted, the words ripping from my throat. "It wasn't my fault." The shadows froze, their whispers fading into silence. One by one, they dissolved, leaving the RV bathed in eerie stillness. When I looked up, Tommy was gone. At dawn, I found the red toy car on the RV table again, but this time it brought a strange sense of peace. I packed my things quickly and drove away, my heart still racing but lighter than it had been in years. I never reported Tommy to the Rangers. Somehow I knew he wasn't a lost boy. He was something else, something that had forced me to confront the guilt I'd been running from. Even now, when the nights are quiet and the shadows stretch long, I think of Ocala and wonder, was Tommy trying to save me? Or was he one of them? I may never know. They say Mammoth Cave is endless, a dark world stretching hundreds of miles beneath the Kentucky hills. For me, the draw was irresistible. An underground maze full of secrets, whispers of spirits, and places few people had ever dared to tread. I'd planned this trip for weeks, armed with topographic maps, lanterns, and a hunger to escape the grind of everyday life. Mark, Emily, and Jade joined almost as an afterthought. They were strangers to me, but each had their own reasons for coming along. Mark was the leader, at least in his mind. A wiry guy with a cocky grin and a GoPro strapped to his chest, he was hell-bent on filming a documentary about the cave's myths. Emily was the quiet one, her fascination with rocks masking something fragile in her demeanor. Jade, on the other hand, was brash and funny, cracking jokes to hide her nerves. And then there was me, Sam, the skeptical one, the loner. I wasn't here for the company. I was here for the caves. We entered through the main tourist path, but Mark had other ideas. "We're not here to play it safe," he said, leading us off the marked trail. The real adventure starts in the wild cave system. By the time we crawled through a narrow passage into the untamed part of Mammoth Cave, I was already regretting it. The first few hours were uneventful. Cool air wrapped around us as our headlamps cast jittery beams against damp walls. Emily occasionally stopped to admire the stalactites, her voice hushed in awe. Jade snapped photos, muttering about how Mark's light kept ruining her shots. Things took a turn when our first lantern died. Cheap batteries, Mark scoffed, rummaging through his pack for replacements. But when Jade's camera started malfunctioning, blurring every shot into streaks of distorted light, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. "Must be the humidity," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. It was Emily who noticed the figurines. Small, crude shapes made of stone and clay, arranged in a circle on a rock ledge. At first, I thought they were just some hiker's prank, but as I stepped closer, my stomach twisted. Each figure was unsettlingly human, with exaggerated limbs and hollow eyes. Stranger still, one of them looked eerily like Jade, right down to the way her braid hung over one shoulder. "Creepy," Jade muttered, snapping a photo before retreating. Mark, of course, laughed it off. Probably just some local artist trying to freak people out. But Emily's face had gone pale. "These aren't new," she whispered. "They're old, really old." We pressed on, but the air felt heavier, colder. The passages narrowed, forcing us to crawl on hands and knees. Emily limped slightly. She twisted her ankle on a loose rock, but insisted she was fine. Her determination was admirable, but something about her unease was contagious. Then came the whispers. It started faintly, like a breeze sifting through distant trees. I stopped, tilting my head. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Mark asked, not bothering to look back. Jade froze beside me. "No, I hear it too. It's talking." "Talking?" Mark snorted. "It's just the wind." Emily shook her head, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. "Wind doesn't sound like that." The whispers grew louder as we moved deeper. Words floated on the edge of comprehension, too garbled to understand, but too deliberate to ignore. My pulse quickened. There was no wind down here, no trees, no explanation. Mark insisted we push forward, despite the mounting tension. "This is gold," he said, holding his GoPro out to capture the shadows dancing on the walls. "People eat this spooky stuff up." I wasn't so sure anymore. My skepticism was giving way to something darker, a gnawing sense that we weren't alone. The shadows felt heavier, the dark more suffocating. My flashlight flickered. Then it happened. Mark stopped abruptly, his headlamp swinging toward a narrow side passage. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The whispers had grown louder, unmistakable now, a voice calling his name. "Mark, don't," I warned as he edged toward the passage. "Help me," the voice echoed, a perfect imitation of Emily's soft tone. "Emily's right here," I said, panic creeping into my voice. "That's not her." But Mark didn't listen. He darted into the passage before any of us could stop him. We waited, shouting his name, but only our echoes answered. Emily clutched her ankle, trembling. Jade paced back and forth, her sarcasm replaced with genuine fear. "We need to go after him." "And get lost ourselves?" I snapped, though the thought of leaving him behind made my stomach churn. But the whispers were back, closer now. I could swear they were saying my name. Mark finally returned, or at least something that looked like him. His flashlight beam wavered as he stumbled into view, his face pale and slack. "I found it," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "What did you find?" Jade asked, running toward him. He didn't answer. Instead, he collapsed, his flashlight clattering to the ground. I reached for it, but the bulb shattered in my hand. That's when I noticed his eyes. Hollow, glazed, reflecting nothing but darkness. Desperation drove us forward, carrying Mark as best we could. He was no longer speaking, just mumbling incoherent sounds. The whispers had become a cacophony, filling the air with overlapping voices in a language I didn't understand. We stumbled into a massive chamber, the ceiling so high it disappeared into blackness. Strange carvings lined the walls, depicting elongated humanoid figures with empty eyes. Emily collapsed to her knees, her breathing ragged. This is sacred," she whispered. "We shouldn't be here." Jade's flashlight caught something at the center of the chamber. More figurines. This time there were 4 of them arranged in a circle. My blood ran cold. One of them was me. The shadows around us thickened, coalescing into shapes. Tall, gaunt figures with glowing eyes. They moved jerkily, as if controlled by invisible strings, and their mouths gaped in silent screams. The whispers grew deafening, filling every corner of the chamber. Jade screamed, snapping photo after photo, but the camera only clicked uselessly. Emily clutched at my arm. "They're hurting us," she gasped. "They're trying to push us toward—" I turned to see it. A chasm at the far end of the chamber, a gaping maw of blackness. The entities inched closer, forcing us back. Mark rose to his feet, his movement stiff and unnatural, and began walking toward the edge. "Mark, stop!" I shouted, grabbing his arm, but his strength was unnatural. He wrenched free, his eyes locked on the abyss. In a flash of desperation, I remembered the figurines. They seemed tied to everything. Us, the carvings, the entities. "Smash them!" I yelled. Jade hesitated, then brought her boot down on the figurine that resembled her. The shadow nearest her dissolved into black mist, vanishing into the cracks of the chamber floor. I grabbed the figurine that looked like Mark and hurled it against the wall. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious but breathing. Emily smashed hers, tears streaming down her face as the entity nearest her let out a bone-chilling scream and disintegrated. Finally, I crushed the last figurine. My own. The remaining shadows evaporated, and the whispers ceased. Silence fell over the chamber, suffocating in its intensity. Dragging Mark, we retraced our steps in silence, too shaken to speak. The air felt lighter the farther we got from the chamber, though the oppressive feeling of being watched never fully left. By the time we emerged into daylight, Mark had regained some of his senses, but his eyes never met ours. Jade refused to look at the photos she'd taken, deleting them all without a word. Emily muttered something about sacred places and curses before limping away toward her car. I haven't been back to Mammoth Cave since. But at night, when I close my eyes, I still hear the whispers. I still feel the weight of those hollow eyes watching me from the dark. And sometimes, just before I drift off, I swear I hear my name. I've spent most of my career debunking myths. Ghost lights, glowing orbs, and magnetic anomalies. Those were my bread and butter. People want to believe there's something otherworldly out there, but it's almost always atmospheric gases, reflection, or some other boring natural cause. That's why I went to Death Valley. I was chasing a myth called the Devil's Lantern. The stories were wild. A red light that appeared out of nowhere, hovered in the air, and lured travelers deeper into the desert. Some said it was the spirit of a lost miner. Others claimed it was the devil himself. The few who claimed to have seen it swore they felt something watching them. I didn't believe a word of it. My plan was simple. Camp near Badwater Basin, where most sightings were reported, and collect enough data to explain the phenomenon. I brought my RV, loaded with equipment, a drone, thermal camera, EMF meter, and enough supplies to last 3 nights. I wasn't afraid of ghost stories. The drive into Death Valley was endless and desolate, the kind of place where the horizon seemed to stretch into eternity. By the time I reached Badwater Basin, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the salt flats. The ground was a pale, cracked canvas, dry and lifeless. I parked the RV at the edge of the basin, far from the main road, and set up camp. The silence was unnerving. No wind, no birds, just an oppressive stillness. The temperature dropped sharply as the sun disappeared. By the time I stepped outside to set up my tripod, the air was cold enough to sting my skin. It was just me, the desert, and the stars. The first night, I saw it. I was adjusting the settings on my thermal camera when something caught my eye. A red light. It hovered on the horizon, glowing faintly. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a reflection or a flare. There were no vehicles or people for miles. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the light. It pulsed faintly, almost like it was breathing. My first instinct was to go after it, but something about the way it moved gave me pause. It wasn't erratic or random. It was deliberate, like it wanted me to follow. Instead, I marked its position on my map and decided to investigate in the morning. Whatever it wasn't going anywhere. By daylight, the desert felt less threatening. The heat was relentless, but I was used to harsh conditions. I set out towards the spot where I'd seen the light, carrying a backpack with water, a compass, and my instruments. The salt flats stretched endlessly in every direction, a maze of cracked earth and jagged crystals. It wasn't long before I found something unusual. Scorch marks. They were circular, about 5 feet across, and perfectly blackened as if the ground had been burned. I knelt to examine them, running my fingers over the brittle surface. There was no sign of an impact, no debris, just a clean, charred outline. I scanned the area with my thermal camera. Nothing. No heat signature, no radiation spike. The marks were cold, but they felt wrong, like a wound in the earth. That's when I heard it. A low hum, almost like the vibration of power lines. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, faint but persistent. I stood still, straining to locate the source, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. The second night, the lantern came closer. I was inside the RV, reviewing footage from my drone, when I saw the glow through the window. This time, it wasn't on the horizon. It was closer, hovering just beyond the edge of the salt flats. My breath caught. It pulsed brighter now, illuminating the ground around it. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The desert air was freezing and the silence was deafening. The light didn't move as I approached, almost as if it was waiting for me. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept walking. 20 feet from the light, my flashlight flickered and died. I froze. The lantern pulsed once, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure, tall and shadowy, standing just beyond the light. But when I blinked, it was gone. The light began to drift backward, slowly at first, then faster, pulling me deeper into the basin. I stopped in my tracks, realizing how far I'd come. The RV was a speck in the distance, and the darkness was closing in. My compass was spinning wildly, the needle refusing to settle. I turned and ran. By the time I reached the RV, my hands were shaking. I locked the door and double-checked the windows, feeling ridiculous for being scared of a light. But the whispers started that night. At first, they were faint, carried on the wind like distant voices. I thought I was imagining them, but they grew louder, clearer. My name, over and over. Evan. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, clutching the steering wheel. The whispers came from outside, circling the RV, always just out of sight. When I worked up the courage to peek through the curtains, I saw footprints, fresh, human footprints leading toward the basin. But I hadn't left the RV. The third night, everything fell apart. The lantern appeared again, closer than ever. It hovered just outside the campsite, its red glow bathing the RV in an unnatural light. This time, it didn't wait. It moved directly toward me, its speed unnerving. I grabbed my flare gun and stumbled outside. The air was electric, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. The lantern stopped a few feet away, pulsing brighter and brighter until I had to shield my eyes. Shadows stretched toward me, writhing and twisting like living things. "Stay back!" I shouted, firing the flare. The light exploded in a burst of red, momentarily blinding me. When I opened my eyes, the lantern was gone, but the desert was alive. The ground rumbled beneath my feet, and the wind whipped around me, carrying those same whispers. I ran back to the RV and tried to start the engine, but it sputtered and died. The dashboard flickered, the lights dimming as the temperature inside plummeted. My breath fogged the air and the shadows outside began to move again. Then I saw it. Not the lantern, but something else. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, its eyes glowing red. It stood motionless, watching me. When it moved, it didn't walk. It glided, closing the distance in seconds. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. The next thing I knew, I was driving, the RV bouncing over the uneven terrain as I tore through the desert. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, the lantern fading in my rearview mirror. I left Death Valley that night, but it never left me. The footage from my cameras was corrupted, the instruments destroyed. No one believed my story. To them, I was just another crackpot chasing ghosts in the desert. But sometimes when the night is still and the air feels heavy, I see it. A faint red glow on the horizon, always watching, always waiting. I'd read about Waverly Ridge on a backpacking forum. Tucked away in a remote part of Angeles National Forest, it was a hidden gem, known for its stunning views and complete solitude. Solitude was exactly what I needed. After a messy breakup and months of soul-crushing work deadlines, I craved silence. Just me, my RV, and my dog, Milo. I didn't care about the warnings in the forum's comments. Don't camp there alone. Weird stuff happens at night. I figured it was just local folklore, campfire tales meant to spook inexperienced campers. I packed my gear, kissed civilization goodbye, and hit the road. The drive to Waverly Ridge was uneventful until the last stretch. The road narrowed to a single lane, winding through the dense forest that seemed to close in around me. The sunlight barely reached the ground, and the GPS lost signal miles before I arrived. A faded wooden sign marked the entrance to the camping area. Waverly Ridge. No fires beyond this point. It looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. Perfect. The first sign of trouble was the trail map at the entrance. It was sun-faded and water-damaged, and the routes barely legible. I had printed a backup map and figured I'd manage. Milo trotted happily beside me as I navigated the RV up the dirt road, his black and white tail wagging in rhythm with the bumps in the trail. The isolation was palpable. No cars, no hikers, just the hum of the RV engine and the occasional chirp of birds. I found a clearing at the edge of the ridge, offering a panoramic view of the valley below. The air was crisp and silent, almost unnaturally so. I set up camp, unfurling my awning and folding out my chair. Milo sat beside me, watching the tree line as if waiting for something to appear. The first night was uneventful, but not restful. Around midnight, Milo began growling softly. At first, I thought he'd heard an animal. Coyotes, maybe. But his growl grew deeper, more urgent. When I peered out the RV's window, I saw nothing. Just shadows and the faint outline of the ridges against the starry sky. I chalked it up to his nerves. He wasn't used to being so far from home. Then I noticed the cairns. Small stacks of stones dotted the perimeter of my campsite. I was certain they hadn't been there when I arrived. Each cairn was perfectly balanced, the stones smooth and round as if selected with care. I felt a shiver run through me, but quickly shook it off. Maybe some hikers had left them behind. Or maybe I'd overlooked them. "Just rocks," I muttered, patting Milo's head. "You're freaking out over nothing." But he wouldn't settle. His ears stayed perked, his eyes fixed on the ridge above. By the second day, things started to feel wrong. I went for a short hike with Milo, following a faint trail that wound up the ridge. The forest felt too quiet, as if the birds had stopped singing just for me. My footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the mossy ground. Milo's usual excitement for exploring had waned. He stayed close to my side, glancing nervously at the treetops. I returned to camp in the late afternoon, only to find my tent slightly collapsed. A broken pole lay beside it, snapped clean in half. At first, I thought the wind might have done it, but the weather was calm and the rest of the camp was undisturbed. That uneasy feeling from the night before crept back into my chest. I distracted myself with chores, fixing the tent and prepping dinner. Still, Milo wouldn't stop staring at the ridge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first silhouette appeared. It stood on the ridge above me, motionless. At first, I thought it was a tree, just a crooked trunk against the fading light. But then I saw it shift. Its head tilted ever so slightly, as if watching me. The figure was too tall, its limbs too long to be human. My pulse quickened as I stared at it, willing it to vanish. But it didn't move. It just stood there, silhouetted against the twilight. "Milo," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He growled low in his throat. I backed into the RV, locking the door behind me. For hours, I sat at the window, flashlight in hand, scanning the ridge. By the time I finally fell asleep, the figure was gone. The third night was the worst. By then, I was running on adrenaline and very little sleep. The cairns had multiplied. There were dozens now, forming a near-perfect circle around the campsite. The flashlight I'd brought with me began flickering despite fresh batteries. Milo refused to leave the RV, huddling in the corner with his ears pinned back. I debated leaving early, but I'd already packed most of my supplies into the RV, and nightfall was too close to navigate the treacherous road out of the forest. As darkness fell, the figures returned. There were more this time, 3 or 4, maybe more, standing at different points along the ridge. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. Every time I looked away, they seemed closer, their outlines shifting subtly in the corner of my vision. Milo barked furiously, scratching at the door as if trying to warn me of something I couldn't see. Then the voices started. At first, it was faint, a low, whispering hum that seemed to come from all directions. Then I heard my name, Morgan. It was my own voice calling out from the darkness. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. No answer. Just more whispers. The flashlight flickered again, plunging me into near total darkness. I fumbled for my lantern, but it wouldn't turn on. Milo's barking turned into a high-pitched whine, and I felt the temperature drop sharply, as if the forest itself had turned against me. That's when I saw it, inside the RV. A shadow, darker than the surrounding blackness, loomed in the corner. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its gaze boring into me. My breath caught in my throat as I grabbed the flashlight, aiming it directly at the figure. The beam illuminated nothing. The shadow was gone, but outside the figures had moved closer. By dawn, I was a wreck. My hands shook as I packed up camp, throwing supplies haphazardly into the RV. Milo barked at every shadow, every rustle of leaves. The figures were gone with the first rays of sunlight, but the cairns remained, a grim reminder of the night before. I started the RV and headed down the trail, determined to put as much distance between me and Waverly Ridge as possible. But the forest seemed to conspire against me. The road was harder to navigate in the daylight, overgrown and riddled with fallen branches. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. Just as I thought I was free, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. This one was closer, its features more defined. Its limbs were too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I didn't wait for it to move. I veered around it, my heart pounding in my chest. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, it was gone. I made it back to civilization by noon, but the experience stayed with me. I tried to tell the park rangers what had happened, but they dismissed it as stress or exhaustion. One of them, an older man with a weathered face, pulled me aside after the others left. "Waverly Ridge," he said quietly. "We've had reports before. People see things out there. Best to stay away." That night, back in my apartment, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But as I got ready for bed, Milo began growling again. When I looked out the window, I saw it. A small cairn, neatly stacked, sitting on the sidewalk below. And in the glass reflection, just behind me, the faint outline of a figure. I didn't expect much from Blackwater Creek. The blog post I'd found described it as haunted and eerily beautiful, but locals love to exaggerate these things. That's what made it perfect for my blog series, Haunted Hideaways. Readers couldn't get enough of ghost stories paired with photos of misty woods and creepy landmarks. Even if nothing supernatural happened, the legends of drowned orphans and a creepy creek were enough to give my readers goosebumps. The drive out to Blackwater River State Forest was uneventful. The roads narrowed as I approached the campsite, the trees growing denser and darker, their gnarled branches forming a canopy overhead. My RV rattled as it bumped over the gravel road, the weight of the humid Florida air pressing down on me. I found a spot near the creek, secluded and silent. Too silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint trickle of water. It was almost unsettling, but I shrugged it off. The isolation was perfect for the vibe I wanted to capture. Milo, my old border collie mix, sniffed around, wagging his tail as he explored the clearing. His enthusiasm reassured me. If he wasn't nervous, there was no reason for me to be. The first night was uneventful, but odd. As the sun set, the air cooled, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and thin across the ground. I built a small fire and cooked dinner, jotting notes in my journal about the setting and snapping a few photos of the creek. When the light faded entirely, I retreated to the RV, Milo settling at my feet. The forest was pitch black outside, the silence punctuated only by the occasional chirp of insects. I'd just started to drift off when Milo growled, a low rumble deep in his throat. "What is it, buddy?" I whispered, sitting up and reaching for my flashlight. He was staring at the window, his ears pinned back. I shone the light outside, sweeping it over the campsite. Nothing. Just the trees and the faint gleam of the creek in the distance. But as I turned off the flashlight, I noticed them. Faint, child-sized handprints smudged on the outside of the window. My heart skipped. They hadn't been there before. I locked the RV door and tried to rationalize it. Maybe some condensation had formed, or maybe I'd missed them when I first parked. Yeah, that was it. I could almost believe it. Until I heard the laughter. Faint and far away like children playing a game. It echoed through the forest, growing louder and more distorted. Milo whined and pressed against me, his body trembling. "Just the wind," I murmured, though I didn't believe it. The next morning, I stepped outside and nearly tripped over it. A doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, its dress filthy and tattered. It sat in the dirt near my RV door, its empty eyes staring at me. I hadn't seen it when I'd parked here. Someone must have left it overnight. But who? There wasn't another soul around for miles. I tossed the doll into the creek, the splash breaking the eerie stillness, and decided to focus on my work. I spent the day taking photos and recording notes about the area. The air was heavy with humidity, and the forest felt alive, as if it were watching me. Milo stayed close to my side, his usual energy subdued. When I reviewed my photos that evening, I noticed something strange. Every image from earlier in the day was gone, replaced with distorted, dark frames. It wasn't just a glitch, it was as though the photos had been erased and rewritten. The only clear images were the ones I'd taken near the creek at dusk. They were blurry, but I could make out faint shapes in the background. Children, or something shaped like children. The second night was worse. A storm rolled in, trapping me in the RV as rain lashed against the windows. The forest seemed to come alive with sounds, branches creaking, water rushing, and, faintly, that same eerie laughter. Milo barked and scratched at the door, growling at the storm, or something in the storm. Then I heard it. My name. Danny. It was faint, barely audible over the rain, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding. "Danny," the voice called again, louder this time, coming from outside. It was soft and sing-song, like a child trying to coax me out to play. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the window. Nothing. The voice grew insistent. "Danny, come to the creek." I shook my head, trying to will it away. "You're imagining things," I whispered, but Milo's barking told me otherwise. The voice shifted, becoming deeper, harsher. "Come to the creek." By dawn, the storm had passed, but the tension in the air remained. I decided to pack up and leave early. This wasn't fun anymore. It wasn't even bearable. As I stepped outside to gather my things, I stopped short. The doll was back. It sat on the RV dashboard, its cracked face grinning up at me. A chill ran through me. I'd thrown it into the creek. There was no way it could have returned. I grabbed the doll and hurled it into the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The third night, I didn't sleep. I barricaded myself in the RV, clutching Milo tightly as I listened to the sounds outside. The laughter had returned, mingled with cries for help. "Please, help us," the voices begged, their tone innocent and desperate. I nearly gave in, nearly opened the door, when Milo barked furiously, snapping me out of my trance. The voices changed, becoming mocking. "Come play with us, Danny. Come to the creek." And then the pounding began. Heavy thuds shook the RV as something struck the walls. The windows rattled, and Milo whimpered, cowering at my side. I shone the flashlight at the door, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow. A tall, distorted figure, too large to be a child. I remembered something I'd read about offerings. Desperate, I grabbed the doll from the dashboard and scribbled an apology on a scrap of paper. I opened the RV door just enough to throw them outside, then slammed it shut. The pounding stopped. The forest fell silent. By morning, the doll was gone. I started the RV and left Blackwater Creek without looking back, my hands trembling on the wheel. When I reached the main road, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but the unease lingered. Back home, I reviewed my recordings. The whispers were faint, but unmistakable. "Danny, we'll see you again." Weeks later, as I unpacked my gear, I found a drawing tucked into my bag, a child's sketch of me standing by the creek, surrounded by shadowy figures. I burned it. But I couldn't burn the memory of those voices or the feeling of being watched. And sometimes when the night is quiet, I hear faint laughter outside my window.